Welcome back to the Burn Bag Podcast. I'm your host, Andre Gonawela. Today, we're diving into one of the toughest but most important questions in national security and innovation. How do startups actually break into the Pentagon? For years, founders and investors have struggled with the basics. Who do you call? How do you get a meeting? And what's the right path to turn a promising idea into something that makes it into the hands of a warfighter? To help answer those questions, we're joined by two people who have been leading this conversation. Steve Blank, the father of the Lean Startup movement and co-founder of Hacking for Defense, and Pete Newell, the other co-founder of Hacking for Defense, CEO of BMNT, and former head of the Army's Rapid Equipping Force. Just a note, folks, I used to work for Pete at BMNT for about 2.5 years. I learned a lot about defense innovation, the innovation ecosystem, and not only the challenges of all of these topics that we're going to be talking about today, but how to actually solve them. So Pete, Steve, and some other folks have just released the 2025 PEO Directory, a publication of the Stanford Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation, America's Frontier Fund, and then BMNT. This is an open source guide to navigating the Pentagon's buying offices, contracts, and programs. It's part phone book, it's part playbook, and it could change how startups, investors, policymakers, and the Department of War work together. We'll talk about why selling to the Pentagon is so difficult, what's changing inside the system, and how this new directory can level the playing field for innovators. So Pete, Steve, thanks for joining me here today.
Thanks for having us.
Okay.
So Pete and Steve, you both have worked with countless startups. Why is selling to the Pentagon so much harder than selling to a regular business?
Pete, you want to go?
No, I'm happy to. The bottom line is the way the Pentagon does business is not the same as the commercial world. But at the end of the day, it's like speaking two languages. And I've said that from my early experiences in Silicon Valley. It's not that the Pentagon is anti-Silicon Valley or anti-startup. They just don't speak the same language. So it's really hard if you're trying to break into it to find a way to translate what you're being told into action that you understand how to take.
And I'll double down on what Pete said, Andre. Particularly for founders who've lived in the B2B world, everything you knew about selling the enterprise is actually detrimental to selling to the Department of War. Wrong people, wrong culture, wrong whatever. So if you're trying to hire those people who sold to CEOs and buyers, you're actually going to dig yourself a hole. Probably the biggest disconnect is in the commercial world, in selling to large enterprises, the company has the money that they're going to buy. In the Department of War, the users and the acquisition people are divorced from the people who are setting the budgets, which is the House Armed Services and Senate Armed Services Committee, and then the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. So the piles of money are separated from the warfighters, who are separated from the people who allocate the money, who are the PEOs, who are separated, as Pete has taught me countless times, from the people who write the requirements, who are in a different organization. And in fact, that's the mess that the Pentagon got itself into, and with the McNamara PBE, which we're partially shooting this year. But the point is that convoluted process looks nothing like enterprise sales. So basically, you have to relearn an entire new language, as Pete said, new processes, new people. And the trap is, of course, is that founders tend to gravitate to the users. Well, the users almost always don't have enough budget to actually solve the problem of building a sustainable company. They help, and then we'll discuss later about their roles. But unlike in an enterprise, it's a completely different model. Pete, is that about right?
No, that's perfect. I was going to say that the user sometimes, in the commercial world, the user is the person who gives you the best feel for what the features need to be of your product, and they're the person you need to get to. In the defense world, the user understands their problem and the context their problem exists in, but you'll find in many cases the users have conflicting input based on context of where they're at. And at the end of the day, the users don't run the system by which things are bought. And the buyers have a whole different set of criteria they look at things. So despite the fact you get the users, you still have to sell to a buyer who may not
Yeah.
agree with the users.
No, I think that distinction between the end users and the actual buyers is what I think complicates this for a dual use company, right? They may have no familiarity with how the Department of War now actually handles these things. And I mean, Pete, when I used to work at BMNT, I was always sort of trying to figure out, like I think I asked my old manager, how do I learn acquisitions? How do I learn the DoD acquisitions process? And I think he looked at me, he chuckled a bit because of how gargantuan and how many webs there are within the DoD. But I mean, sorry, when I say DoD, I mean DOW now. Some habits take a little bit of time to change. But I mean, when we're thinking about that acquisitions process, where is the Pentagon today in acquisitions? Is it tremendously easier than it was maybe 10, 20 years ago, or is it about the same, if not even more complicated?
Pete, you want to take a shot or should I?
Yeah, I'm trying to find a kind way to say it. I would say that in some senses, some things have become easier in
Mm-hmm.
terms of startups getting early traction, early footing, largely due to the DIU's CSO process or OTAs and a lot of the work that AppWorks did was StratFi and TACFi. But all that did is created more entities smacking the DFAR wall. And by DFAR, I mean the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation, because that thing is just as rigid today as it was 10 years ago. So despite the fact we increased the volume, we didn't fix the two main problems. One is the requirement system, JSIDs, which is what tells the buyer what they're supposed to buy for. And then in many ways, the liberties that the acquisition people can actually take in order to buy the technologies they think they need. So, Andre, it's a bit of both. In some cases, it's actually gotten better, which has attracted more private capital to the economy of scale for innovation. And in many cases, it's gotten worse because now you have 1,000 times as many startups fighting for the same scraps.
Yeah.
So we haven't fixed the problem yet. Not yet.
So remember, Pete, they just shot Jace this month, right?
Yeah.
Who knows what they're going to replace it with? Um, but I think Pete raised an interesting point. There's the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, and the DFAR, the defense version of that. But basically, there are also non-FAR acquisition channels, which is, the more you look at it, you realize what they are the DoD's own hacks against their own system. I mean, that's what non-FAR acquisition is that can I get a research OTA or can I get a, production OTA? And it allows you to kind of dance around the formal processes. And Pete, correct me if I'm wrong. The traditional path for a startup, at least the DoD version, if you look at all their websites, is you get a SIBR and then you go through this path, etc. But with the rise of defense VCs, they're looking at their watch and going, "Son, you're going to be out of business by that time." and so what they've done is actually paralleled the path that both Palantir and SpaceX and Andrew followed, which said, screw the acquisition process. We're going right to the warfighter. Whether, historically it was to SOCOM and now it's to, anybody in the field who needs a drone or whatever, we'll sit with you and we'll let you hack the system with us to get us hopefully a production OTA. And, that could get you up to 100 million or more, which is good enough for a startup to stay in business. And I labeled those two different bookends of the path. I mean, there's a million ways to get into the DoD, but one is the patient capital approach is I got some R&D and I need an SBR phase 1 or 2, and I'll spend a couple of years versus the inpatient capital, which is typically venture funded that says, we're not going to live that long. We need to get orders quickly and we need to get you forward deployed and to understand whether these MVPs are valid and needed. And we're going to work around the system. Pete, is that a fair description of what's going on?
No, I think that's a very good description. I think recognizing the role for the Department of War in this process is writing contracts and moving money. The small companies need contracts to produce things in order to attract more investors to provide the funding they need to scale.
Mhm.
And if you understand that that's your role, and you understand how you can use policy and contracts and other things to do that, you'll be successful in nurturing your portfolio of companies to actually get something done. If you don't accept that that's your role, you're actually leaving them on their own and you're shooting yourself in the foot. The exception I'll take, Steve, is the example of Palantir, SpaceX, and other places, because those companies were backed by deep-pocketed billionaires who could afford to spend hundreds of millions of dollars beating the system to death and actually forcing their systems in it. That is not the case with 999% of the small businesses out there. They're actually forced to have to deal with the system the way it is.
Yeah, interesting. And of course today, Andre, I'm sure all your listeners understand the DoD or DOW is engaged in a massive version of innovation theater, and time will
Yeah.
tell. Time will tell whether it's truly innovation. I mean, lots of announcements, a lot of reorganization, lots of whatever. The thing I tend to look at, and again, it's just being optimistic, is what's called the MDAP list, the major defense acquisition programs, and what names are on that. And those names have not budged much in the last 30 years. Even the, even the except if you take out the top 5 new startups, most of the awards to startups are what I call door prizes. A $10 million deal or whatever, where the primes and existing guys are getting, 9 and 10 digit deals, if not more. Um, and some of the biggest things that we're spending all our money on are we're essentially regurgitating 1950s operational tactics with Sentinel and Columbia boomers without ever asking, is there something that the 21st century might actually give us the same type of strategic deterrent before we spend $1 trillion? But those things seem to be off the table in conversation, because if you're General Dynamics, probably have more lobbyists than there are VCs. And I'm not picking on them, but I'm just pointing out the major disconnect between throwing out door prizes instead of having actual conversations about what do we need for national security.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot, in these last few minutes of conversation I want to unpack. I want to definitely unpack the patient versus the impatient path that you briefly explained, Steve, and also want to talk about selling directly to some of these entities in the military. But you talked about how the DOW is responsible for a lot of innovation theater. I mean, it's the idea of like, hey, we're talking about innovation, we're trying to do innovation, but like nothing really comes through. What is the state of the Pentagon's current innovation ecosystem? I think a lot of people in the mainstream will hear about DIU. I think Congress appropriated like I think $1 billion recently to DIU. So that's where a lot of the attention is. We also have these individual innovation offices slash branches within the branches of the armed forces. For example, AFWorks for the Air Force, Army Futures Command, etc. But I mean, is the innovation ecosystem working? Can these startups, can these businesses necessarily rely on the DOW's innovation entities themselves?
So Pete, let me start with a controversial statement, and then you could apologize for me. There's
I could throw 2 more of my own.
at least by the end of the Biden administration, there were 100 or 200 now incubators and accelerators that across back then the DoD, when we had close to 0 5 years earlier. If it were up to me, I would shut every one of them down that are not connected to acquisition dollars, and that's most of them. That is, if you're creating great demos for generals or admirals, that's makes everybody feel warm and fuzzy. But if there is no path to actually deployment, and that's the key, tell me what happens after we do the demo. Do you have capital, and can you deploy at scale? Or is there a requirement for this? Or can we write a requirement for this? And not almost, but when I ask those questions inside those accelerators and incubators, people look at their shoes or point to the posters and coffee cups, and then, the conversation moves on. So I guess I would contend we built it backwards. We should have built a path for how do we deploy things rapidly at scale. and then figure out what kind of incubators and accelerators we need. It's quite possible that that's what this new DOW reorg on all these levels will do. Certainly, Space Force is trying to do that and integrating acquisition with the mission deltas, et cetera. Though, they've created their own language that it's impenetrable to anybody else, including in any other service, to figure out what the heck those organizations mean. But I think their intent is probably closer to anything else. Pete?
I'm going to take a slightly different track and say that, yes, I agree with Steve that most of those innovation theater hubs need to go away. And Andre, to give you perspective on the DIU thing, and I'm not attacking DIU, as the ref director in 2012, I had a $120 million budget, 125 people, and over the course of the year, I invested $1.5 billion of the government's money into attacking problems on the battlefield. People get focused on the budget. I asked the question of what was the impact of the dollars you were given. That in my case, my impact was 10 to 15x in terms of the dollars I could draw from other people to get the work done that our country needed done. If that's the expectation at DIU, they're asking the wrong questions. The question should be, how do we get $10 billion worth of impact from this $1 billion? And then if we give you $5 billion, how do we get $50 billion out of it? So it's a mentality change that DOW's got to have internally. They got to stop looking at the appropriation, patting themselves on the back and thinking they're done. And the same with these organizations. If I gave you a bit of money, show me what you were able to produce from that money. That is having an impact, is scalable and doing something. That's part one. I think the second part is my experience from BMNT, I take from the early days of working with the Department of Energy versus now the Department of War. And the two entities have very different approaches to their role in incubating companies. The Department of Energy is focused on building companies that can commercialize and contribute to the national infrastructure. The Department of War is focused on buying stuff from companies. And they really don't care about building companies. But if the Department of War cared about building companies and scaling them, their incubators would be much different animals. They'd actually be looking at how do they make a company commercially viable so that it can actually sell its components to the government at a bigger scale and a cheaper price, rather than just saying, hey, you got to get to this price point before you buy stuff, and by the way, you're on your own. We're glad to help you navigate the bureaucracy and deal work, but building a company that's your problem. You just go do that. They have very different approaches, and quite frankly, the Department of War's approach is not going to be successful at building scale and at the speed they need to if they think they're going to be reliant on private or venture capital to do that. That's got to change.
Gotcha. So, folks, when we dive into the directory, this is a great guide for how startups, how small businesses can actually navigate the DOW, how they can actually sell to the DOW. And most importantly, it's a playbook, but also a phone book to an extent. So I want to know, we see this term PEO in that directory time and time again. What exactly is a PEO, and why should founders who maybe having a sort of technology capability they want to sell to the DOW, why should a founder like that care about what a PEO is?
The PEOs are the senior buyers. That's the simplest way to put it. And that name's probably going to change in the coming year. Program executive offices are the senior leaders who are invested with the authority to actually buy and buy at scale. And below them, a PEO is a collection of programs. The programs are the ones that have the authority to buy against something specific, assuming there is a requirement that allows them to do that. That's the simplest way I could put it. So if you're trying to sell something, this is your buyer.
Yeah.
Now, navigating PEO's offices defined which program or which product director actually owns the thing when it's unclear what the problem is you're trying to solve is difficult at best. It's usually stacked against you. It's a mass of people to sort through.
So it's like trying to find the buyers at Walmart without a phone book, right? There's not one buyer for all of Walmart shelves. There are hundreds of them. And the Department of Defense has the same thing. There are about, and it changes almost monthly, 70 PEO offices, as Pete pointed out, with probably hundreds. I think the last number I counted, 500 program managers underneath them, all responsible for, as Pete said, for very specific items. Some of them could be literally trillions of dollars, like the F-35 and Ford-class carriers and attack submarines, and some of them are software and PEO digital in the Navy, for example, and very specific instances of small programs. But that's it. And when we were building Hacking for Defense, as Pete knows, for 10 years, our students would go, "Great, who do we call on?" And I would kind of shuffle my feet, and Pete
Now you know why you're in the class.
Yeah, and Pete had, at least a Rolodex of who to call on in the Army, and eventually a much bigger one. But still, it bothered me that we didn't know. And then worse, they'd say, "Well, how do we get funded? I'm an engineer and I have something in the lab." Or someone else would say, "No, I have an MVP. This thing works. Who do I take it to?" And gee, all the military talks about is an SBIR program, but how did Palantir do this, or how did whatever? And so there really wasn't any formal. There wasn't even a diagram that was useful. So I did two things. One, last year, I did the first version of the PEO Directory, which was just a list of names and the beginning of an outline of the number of offices and who they were. And then this year, I realized, well, you can't describe the PEO offices without describing, the acquisition officers around them, the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Gee, this year, the White House plays a big role, and the people are changing the rules on the FAR literally weekly. So who's that, and how's that? Where do I look for those changes? And then, more importantly, draw me a diagram of this, patient capital versus inpatient capital, and at least help me understand what a playbook might look like. And that started with, of all people, with Paul Kwan at General Catalyst, Pete, what's Nini's company's name? Not Vantive. What's
Vanaver Labs.
Vanaver Labs, who started in our Hacking for Defense class. I interviewed them as a case study for a go-to-market strategy, and then realized, well, rather than just doing cases, why don't I kind of take their instances and write a generalized kind of use them as an example without them as the example, because there are going to be multiple ways to go into this. But the point is, there's a 30-page preamble for startups to kind of think about how to put the pieces together that you see on different DoD websites. And then the phone book of who are all the places to go. The best suggestion for anybody reading this is just scroll through the table of contents. And if your head doesn't explode, then you could do a deeper dive. So Andre, I don't know what your question was, but it was fun writing it. It took me a month to put that together.
Only a month.
Yeah, that's a lot of time. I usually don't spend a month on anything other than my kids.
A month is like a year and a half to normal people.
Yeah, everybody goes, "Well, how big was your team in doing this?" And I got to laugh, going, I didn't sleep much.
Lots of opinions helping him.
Yeah. But yeah, it's. And what's ironic, and your listeners probably appreciate this, is I started getting calls from combatant commands going, "Hey, can we get a copy? This is really helpful. We don't even know who's in the PEO office." And now, we kind of an inkling who's downloading this thing. Most of the downloads are from inside the Department of War.
Okay,
I mean, obviously VCs and companies and whatever, but listen, it's a 3 million person organization. It's unfair to think they know who all the organizations and people are. Here's the first phone book.
Well, no, so that's fascinating, actually. So, I think that insight, right? Like a lot of people from the Department of War are actually downloading this guidebook. Is a lot of people generally wouldn't think that, right? But the Navy, the left side of the Navy doesn't know what the right hand is doing basically all the time. So, are these buyers, are these PEOs, are they talking to each other even? Does Sixth Fleet know what Fifth Fleet's doing? Does Fifth Fleet know what Third Fleet's doing?
So I'll let Pete follow up on this, but I saw two trends in putting this directory together. One is, for the first time ever, the Deputy Secretary of Defense has pulled three of the major projects out of the services and said, you're no longer PEOs of those, I am. One is the new one called Golden Dome. The other is the Columbia Next Generation Ballistic Missile Submarine. And the third is the Sentinel program, the replacement for the Minuteman III. Those are the three most expensive new starts that we have, which essentially says, from the ex-head of Cerberus, we don't believe a PEO is capable of managing a multi-hundred-billion-dollar project. I'm going to manage it personally. That's at least my take of that.
Yeah.
And given he did manage $100 billion projects, and given the track record of managing the F-35 and Ford class carriers, that's probably not a bad idea. But it is not a vote of confidence in the service's ability to manage extremely large programs. As I said, just managing them versus questioning whether we want to be replicating a 1950s strategic deterrence strategy with bigger holes in the ground and bigger submarines is a question that doesn't seem to anybody wants to answer. But at least that's number one. Number two is, you're seeing all the services pull up a lot of their activities and autonomy into rapid capability groups. The Navy and Army, et cetera, are all taking those to separate efforts. This is to answer your question, and are attempting to integrate them. Admiral Okano in the Navy, has done a great job in other places, is now head of rapid capabilities. Army has a rapid capabilities group, et cetera. So it seems to be that they're trying to figure out how to better manage with speed and urgency some of these things that have been spread out. Pete, your take?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a couple of different examples. One, I'll start with REF. I will say, as a REF director, I worked on a lot of solutions and technologies that did not fit neatly within any one PEO.
Mm-hmm.
And invariably, when you try and force a PEO to take something on that they're not budgeted for, the answer is just no, or you get slow rolled. So my way of short circuiting the system was, I went direct to the MILDEP at ASALT, which is the three-star acquisition head. I laid out the things and said, here are the gaps, here's where I think it belongs. And I would get an executive decision. I said, would say, this PEO is going to take that. And this PEO is going to take that. And you keep that, because I'm not quite sure where it's going to go. The average combatant command can't do that. So imagine you're a combatant command, whether PACOM or AFRICOM or CENTCOM, and you have a problem, and you've been experimenting with things. What typically would happen is you would have to write an urgent operational needs statement, or something that would go to the JSTID system, which eventually would sign a service to it, who would eventually sign it to a PEO. And you, the combatant command, would never hear from those guys again until somebody wanted to build a potential solution to it. But it was completely in their hands. And of course, by the time all that happens, the person who originally had the problem in the combatant command, he's moved. So now it's become a staff thing. By providing the directory to the combatant commands, we have given them the data they need to pre-compute. They talk to and who they build as stakeholders around the experimentation they're doing. So we're at the point now where a combatant command should not ever experiment with something without doing the background work first to understand where it needs to transition to if they're going to scale it. It doesn't have to be a perfect example, but they need to have an idea when they start what that should be, to actually get something done. The book, once it's turned into a database, now allows them to take a problem statement with the scope of an MVP against a large language model that should spit out, here are the 15 people you need to engage as you're starting this project. And hopefully it will speed that process up for them.
Yeah, because I could imagine that process itself, without the technology, would be taking hours, if not days.
Months.
Gee.
If not years, because people keep moving.
Yeah. No, and that's what's, fascinating about this. And like, if I'm a founder, for example, of a startup, because you're talking about it from the people who are actually in DOW, in those combatant commands, trying to figure out, how to actually solve their problems and who to go to. But if I'm a company who wants to sell, where do I start? Do I start with those PEOs? Do I start with those buyers, or do I start somewhere else? Like, where is my entry point? Is it the PEO?
It's both. And here's what I think you have to understand about the equation for the startup. The startup has traded equity in a company for cash. And that cash gets burned every day, paying for people and paying for things, regardless of
Mhm.
what they do. So they only have so much time to sort this out. So as they start to look for things, in the absolute worst cases, the startup builds the absolute perfect pitch deck and has the best conversation ready and has it with the wrong person.
Hmm.
Which means now wasted all that time to go talk to the wrong person about the thing they do. Or they have to talk to 1,000 people to find the one they want. On the flip side is they accidentally show up in a conversation with the right person, but they deliver the wrong messages because they don't know why they're talking to the person. And now they burned a bridge. So having something like the PEO directory and a playbook allows them to actually accelerate their positioning in those conversations faster, which on the backside preserves their capital for doing other things.
That's the best description I could have done of the thing I wrote. So thank you, Pete, for explaining what it is I did. Um, so it's true. It's that, I would have described the path before as you were essentially blindfolded, throwing darts up in the air and hoping it hits somebody useful in not an important part of their body, but to get their attention. Now, at least the blindfold's off. You still need to get the messaging right and tailor it to the right person. But it gives you some indication of where to go. Now, the bad news about this is the DOW still believes that they ought to be opaque, at least by their actions. And it's been getting worse, not better. Now, it's funny because, it's in the last couple of years when you would have thought they've gotten more transparent with the rise of defense venture capital and the rise of startups. It's actually tied the hands of startups and given the advantage back to large corporations who have tens or hundreds of people to figure this out or actually know have all those existing relationships. Plus, with the social media, our adversaries have 100 people working on this thing. They have a better PEO directory than we do. So the only people that we're putting at a disadvantage by continuing to be opaque is ourselves. Again, it's information asymmetry in a way I just don't understand. And again, it might have made sense when we wanted to protect these people from adversaries when there wasn't social media and there weren't websites and there were only a few primes. It made sense to protect all these relationships. But it's insane now, given that one person could reverse engineer this in 30 days. This phone book should be owned by the DOW, not by me. I mean, like, there's no reason why the DOW shouldn't be publishing this.
I think it's important to note here that everything Steve did is open source.
Completely.
Everything.
Um, I wouldn't touch anything. In fact, no one's offered me it, and I would never touch a phone book from inside the building. But this is all acquirable. As my point is, our adversaries have 100 people doing this. Primes have 100 people doing this. A startup that maybe is hiring a consultant to give them 5 names for $10,000 a month. It's crazy. Um, I truly don't understand why. Well, I guess I do, but it just doesn't make sense why the Department of War doesn't actually publish something like this themselves.
I mean, that is the big question. I mean, it's really a question of like, why is there inefficiency for inefficiency's sake?
Right. Well, again, if you're a incumbent or you're a consultant who is providing this, that this, levels the playing field in a way that's detrimental to your current position, right? Certainly, if I was a consultant now who was being paid to give you a name of somebody you ought to talk to in a PEO office, I'm now just forced you not out of business, but to level up about the services you're going to offer. Um, like, okay, well, you're still important, but now tell me back to Pete's point, what is the right message to this person and in what order should I be calling on these people? That could be incredibly valuable, but not just who's the name of the program manager for the Army unmanned, system.
And quite frankly, if I looked at this as a consultant, say, I look at the book and say, thank God I no longer
Yeah.
have to have people doing junior analyst work, and we can focus on doing the higher level stuff we need to do.
Right.
Because if you could automate this, if you could just automate that first 15 stakeholders that you need to talk to, which is kind of where this idea has come from around the problems we build for hacking for defense.
Yes.
If I could just give somebody that head start, the conversations and the speed at which they learn is 10 to 100 times faster than if we left them on their own. We're back to talking about speed. In getting past these slow, dogmatic conversations is what we need to do. You can't rely on going to AUSA and thinking you're going to run into the 10 people you need to talk to out of 10,000. It just doesn't work that way. So by producing something like this and then combining it with a large language model that has the problems and the experiments and all that stuff, we're actually able now to start producing some really what I would call exotic targeting solutions to hand to a person in the government and say, here's your targeting deck. These are the people you need to engage, and this is why. And if you're a small company, it's the same thing. But now everybody has the right context to be in the conversation. They find themselves much faster and they come to terms with what they need to do in an order of magnitude that we just haven't seen before.
And so take what Pete just said, Andre, of the startup and VC-backed companies going in. But now
Mhm.
imagine for the first time those PEOs and program managers looking out, not to primes, but to new startups. How do I evaluate people who have slide decks? Or maybe they have MVPs. And one of the things, as you know, BMNT and others, mostly BMT is great at, is training those folks about how do you kick the tires in the right way, doing Pete, I think your phrase is technical terrain walk of
Right.
actually figuring out how to interview those folks, figuring out how do you encourage them. And for those forward-looking ones, as Pete pointed out, how do you actually build an ecosystem, not just buy a product? Right. And that's what the DOW has failed to do in general about, wait a minute, if I not just buy from these new startups, but I create a common user interface or a common whatever, or at least seed fund a whole bunch of these things, not just random acts of a Fuse program or a DIU program. I can now have a whole of nation approach to this stuff. We still have not figured that out. And I think it starts at the very basic level of teaching PMs and PEOs how to evaluate new startups they've never seen before, how to actually build ecosystems, and then how to connect them all together. That's something China figured out the minute that Ash Carter stood up DIU in 2015. China announced their whole of nation program. They've been working on it for a decade. We're still trying to, I think, figure it out. Hopefully, this administration is taking the right steps. Once kind of the rubble stops bouncing, and we'll see who's in charge and what they actually start funding at scale. But as I said, I think the direction is correct. But I hope for something bigger and more connected than what we got. But I think our contribution is one is of connection and two is of education on both sides.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And education's huge. And I think, Pete, sort of going back to what you said about some of the exotic conversations that are occurring. I mean, when we think about roadblocks that are really impeding some of these smaller companies, the startups, the dual use tech companies, the non-traditionals, is the biggest roadblock essentially time? Like, is it the days, weeks, months that is really impeding success for these companies in the DOW?
I think the impact is time. I would say it's not the biggest roadblock. The speed becomes the impetus for a different conversation. If the outcome of what you're trying to do is tied to speed as a metric, you have to behave differently than if speed is not the metric. And the timing of your question is beautiful because that's the conversation that Steve and I have been in today and other folks in PMNT is about that friction. If the roadblocks, it's not a roadblock, but it is the multitude of roadblocks you have to fight through that slow everything down. And the roadblocks are faced not just by the commercial company trying to get in, but also the person who owns the program or the product or the thing is trying to solve the problem. They're now trying to fight that same series of problems in order to get something done. The example I use today is we have a client that found through a technical terrain walk the solution to a problem that cost them $50 million a year. And all they needed to do was spend $250,000 from some software licenses to get the product in the hands of enough people to test and confirm that. It's taken 9 months. 9 months to move $250,000 that will potentially save them well over 10 million the first year, and by 3 years, 50 million a year. But the successive roadblocks, first with the CIO, then cyber problems, then the CTO, then some other programmatic thing. It's just, I asked the team to actually annotate every roadblock that was thrown up by who and what actions were taken by the office or by us to reduce the roadblock. Because I think those things are patternable. Once you've done it, you have a real world education that can't be traded for anything. This, my friend Buck Holly would say, is you now have a real world MBA. And that experience is invaluable because you've now seen how to reduce the roadblocks, but you also know the pattern of things that will be thrown up in front of you. So if you're us and you're capturing all that friction and say, okay, here's what it looks like, I can now start to build solutions to them before they occur. And be predictive about what that person has to do in order to get done for the organization. On the flip side, if I see the organization fighting the same thing over and over again, we're able to engage the senior leader of the organization, so you have a repetitive roadblock that somebody's building a workaround that's over and over and over again. Why don't you just permanently reduce the roadblock and fix that?
So this leads me to my next question, and it could be a big one, but I mean, what is the biggest myth that small businesses, startups, even medium-sized enterprises or non-traditionals have about selling to the DOW? But also, what is the biggest myth that DOW has about itself? Or that, when you're meeting people who are working at DOW across all these commands, these various entities, what's the biggest myth that they have about themselves in terms of acquisitions?
Well,
I do. Unless, Steve, you want it?
I'm just going to take the first one about startups, Pete, is that that dual use is a thing. At least, maybe if you're Oracle or Google or Facebook, or someone big, but at least in my mind, if you're a startup, the sales process is different. The marketing process is different. The security things are different. I mean, there's so much different that at the end of the day, the only thing left might be 3 lines of code or the chip you're using. And trying to juggle all that on day one of trying to do both simultaneously, I think is a fool's errand, in my personal opinion. Different VCs obviously have difference. When you're bigger, then you could decide, I was a commercial company and now I want to rebuild my sales, my marketing, my whatever, and figure out how to overlay all those things. Then you might have the resources to do that. But also the timeframes are different for capital. So that's at least myth one. And I'll give you my other one, which I think I hammered at before, is everything you thought you knew about business-to-business selling is actually detrimental in selling to the Department of War. So you need different people with different experience. Pete?
Yeah, I'll argue that dual use is a funding strategy, not an outcome. Dual use is how you use different pots of money to get something done to build your company. For instance, is a startup, can I use SBIR dollars and access to users to iterate against an MVP and learn things about a product before I spend my equity capital trying to produce something that nobody wants? And then can I use what I learned from that to understand the commercial market and the product and attract equity capital because I preserve my equity by using government capital to do something? So that's a dual use funding strategy that allows you to preserve your capital to the point where you need to actually scale your company. The myth that I think for most defense startups is that you're going to be around in 3 years. You're not the next Android, you're not the next SpaceX unless you were backed by multiple billionaires who have the power to keep you in business to get there. That's a myth for 95% of them. I think the myth on the government side is that you can behave like a VC. I see it over and over again. Obviously, we need to behave like VCs. And the first thing is to ask them is, how do you think VCs behave? Do you understand how they make decisions and what the outcome of their decision is and what that looks like in terms of what you do? You should think about it for a minute. I'm a venture capitalist. I'm going to deploy a third of my fund in the first year or so against 20 portfolio companies. And in the next 3 years, I'm going to put most of my money into a few of those companies.
Hmm.
And the last 3 years, I'm going to put it on one. And I'm going to let all that other stuff transition or die because that one is going to make me so much money it makes all that stuff worthwhile. Is that what DOD is saying? We're going to take in all these defense companies and we're going to look at a bunch of different problems, but eventually we're only going to solve one problem. When people are dying by thousands of problems, you don't get to just solve one. You have to work on all of them. In fact, your enemy gets to choose which one's the most painful to you, which means you have to behave differently. That doesn't mean you can't act like a VC, but you have to understand what you're actually talking about. And you have to understand what your job is. Write contracts to companies to build products to help them turn into better companies, not waste money on demos and theater.
So, when we look at the directory, what is one underused vehicle in that directory that you believe more founders should actually exploit? That in your years of experience for doing this work, you've found that founders aren't really thinking about.
I'm going to say contract strategies. And virtually every founder I talk to, one of the things they say is um, you're not looking for just one contract. You're looking for multiple contract vehicles that you can get attached to. Because when it comes to moving money fastest, it moves by the least painful method.
Mm.
And it may be great that you're on a particular contract vehicle to do something, but if the people you want to get money from to do something can't access that, you're never going to get that funding. And I think that becomes more important as you scale because there are lots of different ways for contract discussions and the flow of money to fall apart. And you have to have the agility to be able to move to something else if that doesn't work. Uh, I used that as the ref director to get money to the projects we needed. I had an Excel spreadsheet of contract vehicles we had access to, and I knew how much it would cost me to use a particular vehicle in order to get something done if I were in a hurry versus the cheaper ways to do it. As the founder of a company and an investor in other companies, it's the same methodology. Is you have to build a contract strategy that gives you flexibility and how you engage with different types of money with different offices.
And I'll take what Pete said and at least tell you my version. If what you just heard Pete say and you go, got it, that's what my business development person in Washington does, you're out of business.
Oh,
The CEO needs to understand this. It's not an NP complete problem, meaning it's not computationally unsolvable to understand the FAR, the DFAR, and non-FAR activities. It's not impossible to map out a strategy, but it is hard. You need to learn this stuff. You need to get tutored. The PEO Directory is a great start, and you could hire people in Washington to actually help you understand this. But the minute you stop understanding it, you've now given up control of your company. And so I would take everything Pete said, but just reflect that he understood that as the director of that activity. If you're the CEO and you've said, well, I'm hiring salespeople for this, kiss it goodbye because you're going to spend a lot of money. Someone's going to point you in some direction that you'll have no idea whether this was the right way to go. And given that, as I said in the 30-page preamble, there's kind of bookends of strategy. Your mileage will vary inside, but you need to consciously understand the paths you're taking. Pete, what do you think?
No, I think that's perfect. I was just, reflecting on some of the conversation of the past week about personal responsibility and the number of, I would say, Series A level companies that are trying, particularly in the AI world, because they're trying to create products now rather than just services. And they're finding that services contracts aren't product contracts. And suddenly it's like if 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 I want to move into products, I have to go up these service contracts, but that's where my money's coming from. But if I don't give them up, my service contract's going to end, and I'm not going to be able to sell a product. And you can almost watch the death spiral take place as the argument between the BD guy, the sales guy, the CEO, and somebody else. It's a really hard transition to make if you're headed down the wrong path.
So, Pete and Steve, this has been a great conversation. As we round it out, what final thoughts on, this entire conversation that we've had, would you like to share to our audience?
Go to steveblank.com and look for the blog on the PEO directory, and then download the darn thing and sign up for the updates, because we're going to update it now about once a month. And then see if you can map out your own go-to-market strategy. See where you fit in between. See if you understand who are the people in what order you need to talk to. And as Pete said, what are the messages for each? That's the components of a go-to-market strategy. And it's okay if you get some assistance for that, but if you're the founder of the company and you can't do that and don't understand it, trust me, every minute you don't, that's cash you're burning. And that's loss of control of your company you've put in someone else's hands. So, Pete, to you.
Yeah, do all that and tell us what we got wrong.
Yeah.
And more helpfully is tell us how you've used it to actually get something done. I'm really looking for the real world examples of people putting this incredible body of work to use and helping us continue to rewrite that playbook. It's designed to be a living, breathing document. And we want, the plank owners of the document to be more than Steve, BMNT, and AFF.
Pete, Steve, thanks so much for joining me here today. I really appreciate it. For our audience, we'll have a link to the directory in our description. We'll also have a link to Steve's blog post that he just mentioned in the description as well. Thank you.
Awesome. Andre, thanks so much.